Let's begin our show tonight. I'm Andy Johnson. I'm the facilitator of the International Literacy Educators Coalition, or ILEC. And this is a group of people, concerned educators, that advocates for educators and families to make responsible, research-informed decisions for literacy learning that realizes the potential of diverse learners to be literate, critical thinkers. And if you would like to be part of our conversations, send me an email and I'll put you on our list. As I said, and I'll say it again, I will send out CEU certificates from Minnesota State University to anyone who wants them. I'll put my email in the chat several times tonight. Just send me an email. All right, time for me to shut up and let's get on with the show. Hannah Schneedwind and Jennifer Scoggins will show us how to attend to the affective side of reading development. So have at it.
Thanks, everyone. Well, that was a fabulous introduction.
Yeah.
So I'm Hannah of Hannah and Jen, and I started life teaching first and second grade in Brooklyn, New York. Then I worked as a staff developer in New York City and around the country for 10 years. Then I went back to teaching first grade for 5 years because I missed the classroom a lot. And then for the past, 5, 6, 7 years, a lot of years.
More than that.
Yeah, I've been working with Jen.
Yeah, and I'm Jen of Hannah and Jen, and I started my career teaching first and second grade in Harlem, New York. I spent a number of years there doing that and getting my doctorate at Teachers College. And then after those days, I moved into consulting and was fortunate enough to work alongside Pam Allen, if any of you are familiar with her. And now for the last few years, Hannah and I have been lucky enough to work together. And we're very excited that everyone is here tonight. I can see in the chat some introductions of where people are from. We're from everywhere. And we're definitely curious about, if you haven't told us already, just so it can go by, what level of education, were you first grade, second grade? We have high school people here. And what's your role? If you just want to pop that in the chat so we can make sure that some of our comments tonight are really geared towards some of the roles that all of you have. Ooh, why? Fabulous. And so our goal tonight is really to talk about how kids go about reading and meaning making. And we both believe that this is an active process that's really mediated by students' knowledges, their identities, and kind of the social context around them. That the teaching of literacy is more than just the acquisition of skills and strategies. Not that those aren't important, but here tonight we want to talk about an expansion to build upon that, to consider how those affective components of the reading process come into play. And so Hannah and I are really interested in the idea of student reading identity. And we define a student's reading identity as a story that a person tells themselves about who they are as a reader. And we came to this definition because while there's a tremendous amount in the research about identity formation and how identity impacts kids in their meaning making and their participation in a classroom context, we really felt like we needed a practical, workable, accessible definition that made sense in the classroom. And so tonight we're going to keep talking about this story that children tell themselves and why that matters. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about independent reading and create a clear definition for independent reading, talk a little bit about matters in independent reading, and then go right into those aspects of reading identity. We have some more definitions to share with you about some nuance to reading identity, how you might come to know a student's reading identity and then respond to it. We want to end with a message of how we might be advocates for the expansion of the definition of reading growth in our classrooms. But to start us off tonight, we really want to focus on the idea that the goal for all of our students is an independent reader. It's not necessarily on some sort of product that children produce. We really are focused on what is the process of becoming? How are children becoming independent as readers, and how are they sustaining their independence and their lives as independent readers? And so we think about that, right? Independent reading in the classroom is a construct that seems to be disappearing because of a lot of bloated curricular expectations and a lot of lack of um, kind of agency on the part of teachers to control their own schedules. But in reality, we have decades of research that shows that independent reading, it does all the things. It does all the things we want it to do, meaning that when kids are reading independently and in volume, they're more proficient, they're more motivated, they have a greater amount of background knowledge, they're more empathetic, they're more emotionally resilient, they have higher grades. I mean, anything that you possibly want for your students, independent reading is a very strong foundation that we can use to get them there. So the research is there behind this. However, when you talk to anyone about the idea of independent reading, sometimes you can get kind of a different answer about what does that really mean. And in some places, independent reading really just means take your book and go read, which is wonderful. But Hannah and I have defined independent reading as having 4 large principles. The first being time, right? So children need time, long stretches of time to spend reading and rereading and kind of managing their lives as readers, which give us time to get to know them as readers. Children need choice in independent reading so that they have wide, authentic choice based on their interests, what they're able to do independently with success and accuracy, choice of genre, author, text type, what have you, like wide choice. Independent reading also stands on a principle of talk. We always joke that when we walk into classrooms, if it's like super duper silent, like no one's talking during independent reading, our spidey sense goes off a little bit because we know as kids are reading and super engaged in books, they want to share it with a friend or show them the gross parts in the informational text or laugh out loud. So independent reading is a place that where talk abounds about the text. And then finally, of course, teacher support. And so we're thinking about what are the ways in which teachers are supporting students one-on-one in those moments with the text in the ways that they need in that moment. That isn't possible to prescribe. It's really about the talk, listening, and time for teachers to give students the support they need in that moment. And so when we think about all of that, how do we create an environment where independent reading can really thrive? And what are the things that we have to think about as educators as we start to support our students in their pursuit of being more independent and sustaining an independent reading life? And as we start thinking about those 2 things, you'll see these 2 columns, right? Hannah and I are self-proclaimed research nerds, and we love to read. I mean, any study, any journal, we're gonna dive right in with it. And you'll see on the left-hand side, we have we want to make sure we're considering research about things that I would associate with skills and strategies, things that you are likely everyone on this Zoom tonight are hugely familiar with. Right. But we also want to consider the research on the right-hand side in that column. And these are the more effective parts of the teaching of reading that often don't get a time and attention in a curriculum or a time and attention during our school day. And those are things about how kids are feeling about themselves, how they get engaged, how they approach challenge, and how they kind of sustain and persist over time. And so we're not saying that it's one or the other. We're really living in a space where it's both and. And we do think that too often teachers are put in a position where they have to decide between one or the other. And we aren't here to say we're just doing the skills and strategies or the affective work. It really is a matter of both and that's in response to what we understand about our students as readers. Peter Afflerbach, if you aren't familiar with his latest book, it's called Teaching Readers, Not Reading. And his work has been really influential to Hannah and I. And it's the idea that we're not necessarily teaching reading, we're teaching readers. And so that might mean we have to lean on research about fluency, we have to lean on research about agency, and different kids are going to need different types of support from us. And so we want to lean holistically on a wide range of research so that we're drawing from this big base and meeting all the diverse needs of our readers, not necessarily just delivering skills and strategies.
So that leads us right into our definition of reading identity. So we really did two kinds of research to come up with our definition. As Jen has already said, we love academic research. So part of our definition came from voluminous reading around topics such as motivation and engagement, reading habits, reading volume, etc. And then the other part came from us going into schools and talking to hundreds and hundreds of children. And to each child, we would start the conversation by saying, "Tell me a little bit about yourself as a reader." And at the beginning, that's all we would say. And then we would listen to what their answer was. And then we would just ask the things that came up naturally. Then we had all of these transcripts of all of these hundreds of students, and then we started coding and sorting and looking for patterns. And what we discovered when we looked at all of the students' answers was that they fell into these distinct categories. So then we had all the categories, we went back to the research, and we married them. So this is how we came up with our definition of reading identity. We want to be very clear that it is always growing, changing. Even as I'm talking about it tonight, you're probably going to think to yourself, ooh, what about that? What about this? I would add in that. So please do. This is in no way, a finished product. It's really something that we developed to really support teachers in the classroom. So let's talk about them kind of one at a time. So affect means exactly what you think it would mean, which is how do I feel about reading and how do I feel about myself as a reader? And that can be a little more complicated than it might sound. So for example, you might have a student who can read, who's a perfectly proficient reader and says, reading is so boring because they might not like the choices that they're being given in school. You might have a student who struggles with reading, who says, oh, reading is really hard, but I really love it. And so when we say it's how a student feels about reading and about themselves as a reader, both of those parts of affect are really important. If you see the little plus and minus sign, it's also really important to notice that there's no such thing as a good reading identity or a bad reading identity. However, a student might feel positively about themselves as a reader or negatively about themselves. But again, to be super clear, there's no such thing as this is a good kind of reading identity and this is a bad kind of reading identity. We're not using any labels like that. Attribution refers to how students really are making sense of their reading experiences. What are the reasons are they assigning either to their success or to their failure? And attribution really matters because if I have attributed my failure to an outside source, I might say, oh, well, it's just that teacher. That teacher doesn't like me. I haven't found a good book. That's really going to change how I go about working on something. If I have a low sense of attribution and I say, I just can't do it, that is really going to impact how I see myself as a reader. So having that positive or negative sense of attribution is incredibly important. You can probably think right now of students in your care who would have a lot to say about both of those things. Self-efficacy is really the concept from Bandura, and it refers to a student's belief regarding their capacity to do what readers need to do and be successful at it. A much simpler way of saying it is, what is my level of confidence? How confident am I that when I sit down with this book, I'm going to be able to read it? Or how not confident am I that I'm going to be able to take on that challenging task? And self-efficacy is really formed by all of the students' previous reading experiences. Whatever grade you teach, no child comes into us as a blank slate. They bring their whole selves with them into the classroom, and they bring all of their reading history. So we're always very interested to know, why do you feel this way, right? Tell me a little bit about reading last year, or tell me a little bit about reading at home. We're trying to put the pieces together so that we can understand where their sense of self-efficacy comes from. The next aspect of reading identity is text choices and purposes. So this, as you'd imagine, is a pretty enormous category. And it's often one of the first things that students say to us when we say, tell me about yourself as a reader. They often go to telling us about their favorites. And so text choice refers to what they read, how they read, and why they might read. So it includes their preferred genres, their structures, their authors or topics. It includes what they do not like to read. So, for example, I've had students say, oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm learning about the American Revolution again. We do this every year, right? So there might be topics that they don't want to read about, and that's part of it as well. It's also what they consider when they do choose a text. So are they thinking about interest? What is their understanding of level or readability? How much do they take into account what other people have recommended to them? And then, of course, a huge part of text choice is, why am I reading this in the first place? It is so fascinating to say to students, so tell me a little bit about why you read. And if you just imagine posing that question to some students with whom you work, you would imagine you'd have a huge range of answers. Some students are extremely purposeful. I picked this book because I really am fascinated with World War II, and I am learning everything I can about it. Other students might look at you and really not know how to answer that question, because they don't have a lot of choice. So they haven't really thought about their purpose. Why am I doing this? So again, really important part of their reading identity. I know I'm going through really quickly, but there's a lot to talk about. So habits includes everything about where they read, when they read, how long they read, how frequently they read, where do they like to read at home or at school. You'll see here, by the way, a picture of a child in Slovakia. I was recently in Slovakia, a country that is trying to get independent reading up and going. And I asked the students where they read. And I just had to pick this one because this little boy showed himself very clearly. It's nighttime, so that's why the light is there. He really wanted us to know that he was reading in bed at night. And then he said, oh yeah, and that's a monster under my bed. He just said it so matter-of-factly, like, of course there's a monster under my bed. So one of the things that we do think about when we think about habits is this. We know that students are not necessarily in control of their habits. That is to say, I may not be able to read at home. I might not have access to books at home. So we're really always approaching habits with a sense of curiosity. Tell me a little bit about this, and then we might think more about their habits in the classroom as opposed to their habits outside of the classroom. So that's an enormous category. And then the last category is what we call reading process. So Jen and I have found that Duke and Cartwright's 2021 active view of reading most accurately really captures the complexity and the nuance of all of the skills and strategies that go along with reading. So when you think reading process, think of all of that reading stuff that right, that we showed on the one of the original slides: oral language, phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, etc. And it includes metacognition. Metacognition really refers to my awareness of the strategies that I am using. And that metacognition is incredibly important. So there's research, because we have to quote the research, but there is research that shows that in general, metacognition is really key for successful learning. So we'll say to students, what are you thinking about as you read? And then it's really interesting for students to say, oh, I always think about character. Oh, I'm noticing all the really gross parts. Oh, I'm trying to put these two books together to see what's similar or different about them. We also like to ask them, what do you do when you get to a word you don't know? Again, students' answers reveal a lot about them. So all put together, all of these aspects make up a student's reading identity. So if you just want to put in the chat for a minute, sort of out of those descriptions, what's really resonating with you right now? Maybe you have a student in your class you're thinking about right now. Maybe it makes you have a question or a wondering about a student. Just take a minute and put that in the chat.
Or if you have any questions or thoughts about our definition of reading identity. Oh, thanks, Fran, for putting that link idea in there. Thank you to the active view of reading. Well, and Sarah's saying she's talking about truth telling. And I think that's so important because when we approach students from like a non-judgmental stance and allow them to say things like, I don't like to read, or I find I find it very challenging, or I hate it. When that's an okay answer, we're starting from a place of truth and we can move forward from there. I mean, it hurts our hearts a little bit for sure, but then we can find out and start to think about what is the source of that feeling and how do we make a dispositional shift, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. Yes. Exploring reading identity. Yeah, and right, these are fantastic, fantastic things in the chat. The chat's going so quickly, right? And you're right. And Susan's talking about how like this is something that works across all ages. We're really and the research is showing us that children as young as kindergarten are able to understand who they are and express kind of what they're thinking about and what they want to do in really clear ways that we have to listen to. And that there is sort of a malleability, particularly in grades 4 through 7 and 8, where we really can support dispositional shifts when we might think that students are displaying kind of a negative sense of self as identity. But I dig it. So let's talk a little bit about motivation and engagement, right? Because these are important constructs. And Hannah and I have placed them kind of alongside the idea of reading identity. So here's who I am as a reader, but then motivation and engagement really kind of build upon what we understand about our students and really factor into how our students attack reading tasks and reading themselves. So we think about motivation engagement. They're separate constructs, right? And we want to make sure that sometimes they get mushed together and they feel like very similar, but we want to kind of, while they work together, we want to isolate them tonight for the purposes of conversation. So Hannah and I define motivation as a student's drive to read. I also like to think about it as their level of persistence while they're engaged in reading. So we think about motivation, of course, I'm talking about intrinsic motivation, not extrinsic. Like we're not talking about reward systems, sticker charts, all of that. I'm really talking about that internal desire that kids have that drive them to read. If you're my son right now, about Napoleon, I don't know why. Or to be driven, I don't get it, or to be driven to read the entire series. What is it about that gets them to do that thing and to stick with it, right? And so motivation leads us to engagement. Here's a definition about Renzulli, a definition by Renzulli that talks about that infectious enthusiasm, right? It's that sense of curiosity, how enthusiastic kids are, what is their interest? And even that felt a little, we all know what it feels like, right? We all know what it feels like to be engaged in gardening or a book that you can't stop thinking about. That feeling of engagement is something that we all understand kind of on a visceral level. But as Hannah and I were starting to think about, it needs to be more than a feeling, right? It needs to be something that we can talk about in ways that are more definitive, because we know that engagement exists along a continuum. Students might move from occupying a space where they're feeling disengaged or exhibiting disengaged behaviors. They might just be kind of going along with the flow and in a place of compliance, and they might be highly engaged, right? And we're all, I mean, if we're honest with ourselves, like whether we're hungry during the day, we've had a long day, we all kind of vacillate along that continuum of feeling engaged. But here, McGowan and Smith just this year put out these 4 dimensions of engagement that Hannah and I feel are important for us to share, because they bring kind of like a sense of practicality that we can like talk about what it is that kids are doing. So we have 4 dimensions, the first being behavioral engagement. Think about the children who read the whole time during independent reading. They try a variety of texts. You know, those are the kids that are reading for independent reading for the whole time and may or may not have a robust reading life outside of the classroom. Then we've got cognitive engagement, thinking about, when am I actively engaged in using all the skills and strategies that maybe you taught me in a read aloud or a small group, and you can kind of see it coming together for students in their independent reading and see them pulling on those scaffolds in the classroom to really try to do those things independently. Then, of course, affective engagement are the kids who, so you're reading the whole time, you're pulling all your strategies, and then maybe you laugh out loud, or you're like me and you have to cry at the end of certain books, no matter how many times that you've read them, that it really has kind of that emotional pull on you. And then, of course, social engagement, that need to tell someone about it, hear what their point of view is, share that idea. So we think about how kids move along this continuum of engagement. We can also think about what dimensions of engagement do they exhibit or not exhibit in certain situations, and how can we as teachers invite increased engagement in those ways. So this is a fantastic resource that we really think adds some practicality to the idea of engagement. So as you're thinking like, okay, reading identity, that sounds great. That's lovely, Jen and Hannah, but how do I get to really understand that for each of my students? And there are 3 key methods that Hannah and I rely upon in order to really uncover how students are presenting themselves. Because of course, students are the only ones who can construct and reconstruct who they are as readers. We're just trying to listen in and come to understand that. So we really rely on kid watching, observation during independent reading, all sorts of times of day, inquiry, and conferring. Tonight, with the constraints we have around our time, we're really going to focus in on conferring, just because it allows us to have those one-on-one conversations with children and listen really intently as they construct themselves kind of for us. And so Hannah and I have developed something that we call the Discovery Conference. The Discovery Conference is a one-on-one reading conference whose sole intention is to learn more about a student's reading identity. The intention of this conference isn't necessarily to teach a skill or a strategy. The intention isn't to follow up on some sort of lesson that was done. In this moment, our sole intention is to learn about who this student is as a reader, because that's enough. Because of how that opens up instructional possibilities and allows us to see them more clearly. And you'll notice, so I don't do math, but you'll notice I think this triangle is upside down. And math people say it's not. I think it's upside down because it's standing on the pointy part. But you'll see that it filters from these broader questions and goes to a more specific point. So when we start off broadly, we're asking kids like, hey, just tell me about yourself as a reader. And kids will often start in all sorts of places with that question. And we're kind of listening and following them down this pathway that they take us. So you'll see that Hannah and I have outlined some possible questions. It's not really an interview. These are options so that we're able to kind of follow the lead of the child. But we're starting with those big ideas like, tell me about yourself as a reader. How do you feel about reading? What do you think about when you pick books? And as we move along in the conference, we might get a little bit more narrow to say, hey, read a little bit to me from that book that you're in the middle of. What do you think you could do there if a child maybe gets stuck on a word? Or as the child's reading, be like, hey, what do you think about that? Like, how did you come to that idea? So we can really gain some insight in some of the meaning making work that's happening inside their minds. And then the conference ends, the pointy part, which makes me think it's upside down, with us specifically naming a strength that that student possesses. And this is really highly linked to that idea of developing and supporting a student's sense of self-efficacy, which Hannah also talked about as the idea of confidence. So we want to say something like, may I give you a compliment? May I tell you about something that I learned about you today? And just those words are kind of like magic fairy dust. Like kids will sit up a little bit and say like, all right, like I'll take the compliment, but it allows them to understand like, oh, I'm going to receive this feedback. She's not going to tell me something that I need to work on. She's really paying attention and sees me for who I am. And then you give kids something that you learned about them. I noticed that you're the kind of reader who really falls in love with characters and can't stop thinking about them even when reading time is over. That's something that's really going to help you live a really long reading life, because you just need to get to know more and more characters. And we can name strengths from the skills and strategies section of reading, like those types of ideas, or we can lead with strength about those more affective components. I saw how confident you were when you attacked that word that at first gave you a little bit of a challenge. So it's really about starting from that place of strength and where do we go from there. And so here are some examples of things that children have said to us. I mean, I don't know. I think they're too funny. I love, you ask a kid a question, you're like, here we go. And so students might say things like, this little young kindergartner you see on the bottom left said like she wanted to get better at reading because her sister was in plays and she was desperate to be in a play herself, but she needed to be able to read the script, and she was in kindergarten and kind of in process. And so when you think about that little story, your first thought is like, oh, that's cute. But you're really, this kid's telling us, I have a really authentic purpose for reading. I am driven and motivated to engage and challenge because I want to do this thing. I know reading is going to provide me a pathway to this place. And now we can talk about why you need to read those words, fluency, expression. Like there's so many opportunities just by following the lead of like what she told us about who she wants to do, or who she wants to be as a reader. But then if you look at the top left, a student might also say to you, hey, I like to read when I get to choose, but reading in school is boring because I don't get to choose. And now, first of all, I would praise any teacher who has a student that is able to say something like that, because that means you have the kind of classroom environment in which kids feel like they can trust you to say things like, I think this is boring. But it also says a little bit about like, oh, the motivation and engagement may be off here. And I wonder what are the types of texts that might interest this student? And maybe I'm not seeing what they're capable of because they may not be choosing to engage in the tasks I'm setting up because this doesn't feel authentic or meaningful to them. So it's really a place from where we can open up a lot of instructional pathways beyond the delivery of skills and strategies. Not that those aren't important, but in addition. So I don't want anyone to say she thinks they're not important. So in terms of some questions that Hannah and I are asked fairly often, particularly in relation to the Discovery Conference. The Discovery is something that conference you may not want to do at the very beginning of the year because, of course, it kind of sustains itself on a trusting foundation. So you want to get to know students a little bit, but towards the beginning of the year, as you've been in there for a few weeks and have had some conversations, a Discovery Conference usually takes somewhere between 5 and 7 minutes. They aren't incredibly long. We often recommend that teachers do them 3 times a year, right? So you want to kind of figure out who they are in October and then ish, depending on when your school year is. And then a few months later, poke around at those questions again. Like, who do you think you are now? Tell me about yourself now. What do you think about now? And then maybe at the end of the year to allow students the space to reflect on themselves, but also kind of reconstruct themselves alongside all of these opportunities they've had for learning. So it's something we recommend doing at least 3 times a year. They last 5 to 7 minutes. Am I missing any FAQs, Hannah?
No, I think that's it. The only other thing that I know I got a lot of questions about is what about my kindergarten students? And so it
Mm.
depends a lot on your kindergarten class. Sometimes in kindergarten, you might not have some of these discussions until January.
Mhm.
Some students come in at the very beginning of the year and they absolutely can talk about who they are as readers. You might do it in kindergarten as more small group discussions. I've done them as table conferences, like during independent reading. I just come over and say, so, hey, can you just all tell me a little bit about yourselves as readers? So that's really a teacher judgment. You know your students, you know your class. I will say I had a very funny kindergarten experience this year. I said to a little kindergartner, and it was like day 2 of school. I'm really not kidding. Day 2, the kids were just looking at whatever books they had. And I said, so tell me about yourself as a reader. And she said, Miss Schneewind, you're so silly. I can't read. Um, that said a lot about her as a reader because she said it with this huge grin on her face, which meant she gets that she could do storytelling, but she wasn't yet accessing the print. So, in fact, her response did tell us a lot. That, of course, is very different than an older child saying, oh, I'm not a reader. So that's the only other question I would say we do get a lot is, with younger students, when in the year might you start at? Um, all right, so we want to now move on to kind of the now what. So let's imagine that you've done some discovery conferences, you've gotten to know your students as readers. Of course, you've also done your other reading assessments. Maybe you've done running records, and so you know what they are doing in terms of, well, I'll just say lots of other things because you've done your running records. And so you want to put together all this information. The Discovery Conference does not stand by itself. It lives alongside of lots of other small data sources. And then you're kind of thinking, so now what do I do? And so we have thought over the years of dividing them into 4 responsive moves: affirming, acknowledging, reframing and shifting, and expanding. And I'll just quickly tell you a little bit about each one. So I want everyone right now, think of a student with whom you have worked who's super confident, the student who comes and saying, I love reading and I'm so excited for my next grade because I really want to read this series because I know all about it and my big brother read it and reading is great. So I want to affirm where that student is. They are very confident. So when I'm talking to them, I want to affirm who they already are as a reader. And so when I'm talking to them, I might say things like this. I might say, hey, may I tell you a little bit about what I just learned about you? Did you know this about yourself? You're the kind of reader who feels really confident about her reading. Now, I have to tell you, the first couple times I said that, I thought this is not going to go over well with kids. Kids react to this so strongly, kindergarten through 8th grade, because they don't necessarily recognize that confidence is a strength. And so I'm saying it because I know all the research and I know if the student is confident, she's going to go on and be able to take all of these other challenges and keep growing. So to tell the student that that is such a strength is really quite transformational for the student. It's going beyond saying, I like reading, to them realizing, oh, this is really a strength. I'm confident I can do more of it. So those are just some examples of what I might say, right? For the students who come in, they're like, we love it. Now, let's think a lot about the students about whom we are the most concerned. So we all have students who are not where we would want them to be and not where they would like to be. It is incredibly important to acknowledge that. And this goes back to that idea of truth telling. The absolute worst thing you can do to a student who says, I don't like reading, is say, oh, honey, that's not true. You just haven't found the right book. Or, of course, you love reading. Everybody loves reading. That's terrible because you just wiped out every single thing that I'm telling you, you are showing me you do not understand me. So we really need to acknowledge our students when they tell us these things. And so, what does that sound like? And of course, we're not acknowledging that they are somebody for whom reading is a struggle. Like, that's a good thing. We're acknowledging that that is how they feel about it. So, I'm going to use the very same language that they used with me. So, at the end of the Discovery Conference, these are some things that I might say, right? You're reading who knows? Reading can be hard sometimes, because that idea of self-knowledge is actually really powerful. You know yourself well, you realize you like to read more when you get to choose what the books are, right? Again, that's really important to acknowledge to them. Maybe you haven't found books you like. You like books, but you're not really confident. So, all of these things are really helpful. Again, we know as teachers, we need to really acknowledge when we have those students. So, could everyone just pause for a moment and think of a student? Could be a student you're currently teaching, it could be a college student for those of you who are professors, it could be a younger student. Think of a student. What is something that you might want to affirm about them? And then what of their struggles might you want to acknowledge? So you can put that in the chat for a minute. Obviously, no student names, but just think about some students. I know it's tricky to do.
Or people are furiously typing. You don't know.
Yeah, well, I think so. It's hard to do in a short period of time. So I'm going to let you go ahead and think because that is kind of a big question. Um, so then when we have these students, we don't just leave them saying, all right, great, I understand reading's hard for you, right? We don't stop there. Then, of course, what we want to do is go on and help the student shift how they are feeling about themselves as a reader. And this is really important. I cannot do the shifting. What I can do as a teacher is set up what Bandura called mastery experiences and what Jen and I now like to call success experiences instead. So my job as a teacher is to set up success experiences for you to help you shift your negative self-perception of yourself as a reader. But I cannot do the shifting, right? I have to help you do the shifting. And so if I'm reading with somebody, these are some things that I might notice about them to help them shift, right? This book had tricky parts and you use strategies. I notice you use what we talked about in the read aloud, right? I'm talking about transfer, or you gave a new author a try, you liked their work. So imagine this student keeps saying, I can't find anything, and I've curated a book set for them at books that are comfortable for them to read, and they try it. So this would be another, few hours for us to talk about all the ways in which we are shifting students so that we're helping them shift their self-perception. This is just to give you, again, a few ideas about it. So you again think for yourself, what success experiences might you put together to invite a shift? And then the last move that we think about is expanding. So go back to your student who comes in, they're reading, they're super confident, everything's spectacular. And of course, we want all of our students to grow. So with that student, we're affirming that they're confident, they have really strong strategies in place, and we want to help them grow to do other things. So this is what that language might sound like. We might nudge them to try a different genre, right? We might nudge them to try a different author. We might nudge them to think about something differently. Maybe all they ever do is think about character, or maybe when they're reading nonfiction, the only thing they ever do is list facts. So whatever it is they're currently doing, we're saying, great, you're doing this. What else can you do? So those are kind of the four big moves that we think about when we do think about reading identity.
And before we move on to reading growth, Lynn, a while ago, asked a great question, and I said we saw it, about how does this work around reading identity and this idea fit in with like where's the role of explicit instruction in skills and strategies? Like how do these two things merge together? Because of course, skills and strategies, I think that explicit instruction is incredibly important. And so when Hannah was talking, she kind of touched on it a little bit when we were talking about the designing of what Bandura called mastery experiences, Hannah and I call success experiences. When, as a teacher, you know, I like to think that when we're planning a lesson, it can only go one way. But when we're preparing to maybe teach a very specific skill and strategy, we're really ready to do that really explicit work, but also to move in a variety of directions to respond to how our students respond to that strategy. And so we think about reading identity and what we understand about them, you know, it really helps us to pick text selection that's engaging, to really nail down like what are some of the purposes that my students feel are relevant to them, like what are their purposes for reading, and how will this skill and strategy help them in their pursuit of these purposes, and how can I make that clear and transparent for them, so that the classroom is predicated on this idea that they're telling me these things about their purposes and I'm using them in their planning and my preparation and building these concrete kind of bridges for them between this explicit instruction and where they want to go as a reader. It also, as we're thinking about their identities as readers, allows us to be able to name the strengths that they already possess, so that from their sense of self-efficacy and confidence, they feel like they have a jumping off point. We can name and call those out with specificity. And we can also think more about patterns across our classroom. So if we're thinking about reading identity, we start to see this pattern where perhaps our students aren't being really reflective about when I use one skill or strategy over another. That might mean that in this lesson where I'm explicitly teaching this skill or strategy, I'm also going to include what it might sound like to reflect on when to use this, or was it successful? So that I'm modeling kind of that metacognitive process that I want them to go through. And maybe I notice like as a pattern that that's something that kids could use a little bit more support on. And so as I'm starting to describe the type of preparation one might do to do some explicit strategy or skill instruction, these types of modifications are things that can't happen when you're using something that's scripted and one size fits all. It can only really come from when we're using explicit instruction and kind of pulling on all of our knowledge of reading identity across the classroom to make it feel relevant and transferable. There's a tremendous amount of research about the idea of agency in the classroom. And when kids start to feel like they have an active voice in their learning, they're more likely to be motivated and engaged to like even bother trying what we're saying. Like you can teach the pants off a skill or a strategy, but they got to want to do it. And so we think about that. It really is pulling in these things that they're telling us to show we're listening and we are responding to what you're telling us by modifying our instruction to kind of suit your purposes and needs. And so creating that kind of agentive classroom really means you're setting kids up to kind of work at their full capacity. And so there's a lot of power. And I hope that answers your question, Lynn.
Can I just add on one more thing?
Totally do it.
So if you remember, one of the things that I said was the Discovery Conference does not stand on its own. So when Jen is talking about skills and strategies, picture that I've done the Discovery Conference and I have all this other data that I have about the student. And so if I have a student who does not feel fabulous about themselves as a reader, and I'm thinking about what experiences does this student need to shift how they're feeling, I am thinking a lot about readability. And that is where my direct instruction comes in, because it might be that what that student needs more help on is decoding. But instead of just doing decoding in kind of a vacuum, we are really marrying it with, as Jen said, that motivation and engagement. Because if we don't have that part going, you could teach and teach and teach, and the student literally is not going to be able to learn it. So absolutely, there's direct instruction that goes right to the very specific targeted areas that a student might need. We're just not talking about that, all of that part tonight. So, but thank you so much for asking that question.
Mhm.
And that's why, as Jen said at the beginning, we're all about and. So it's like reading
Mhm.
identity and everything else.
And we feel like there are such a wealth of resources when you're in that skill and strategy instruction. There's a wealth of resources where you can turn to be like, oh, here's the skill, here's these strategies, here how it might sound. And our goal is not to, it's out there and it's fantastic work, is to say like, well, what might it sound like if I was going to respond to these affective parts? So we can kind of marry that work with the really strong work that's already out there in terms of skills and strategies. And all of that to say is that we do come from this place of and so Hannah and I really believe in an argument or advocating for an expansion of the definition of reading growth, right? We measure what we value and we value what we measure. And right now, when we talk about reading growth, often in schools, and I know that conversation isn't something that sometimes is defined on a report card or assessments or whatnot, but it is highly linked to the acquisition of skills and strategies. And did a kid jump through the hoop at the right moment that they were asked to jump through said hoop? And we're saying, what might it mean if reading growth meant more than just that, right? So reading growth might mean like, hey, like you've really pushed on your ability to determine the meaning of determine the main idea of informational text and really develop those skills and strategies. And it can also mean finding a new purpose for reading. What if reading growth also meant you've read for longer stretches of time, you found a new purpose, you and your partner discovered a new series this year, or you feel more confident now to take on a reading challenge? That's growth. And too often that type of growth isn't something that we draw students' attention to in really serious ways. And so we're hoping that as we start to expand what it looks like to teach reading and to teach a reader, that we can start to name and value and push our leaders and administrators and schools to also formalize the way that that growth is recognized. We have a story of a teacher who Hannah worked with, and a student was reading below the benchmark grade level where the school wanted them to read for that grade. But the child had made tremendous amount of growth and still fell short of that benchmark. And the teacher with like tears was like, all they're going to see is that they're reading below grade level. But really the child had moved from exhibiting disengaged in behavior to being incredibly engaged and finding books they like, and it made so much growth. So there's a lot to say about the notion of expanding that definition. And so like, I just, how many times can I hit that? But really we're talking about the interdependence of your growth in those skills and strategies is also intertwined with the growth in all of those more affective components of identity that we talked about tonight. Kathleen, I see your question. If there are any tips on how you organize your data and use it to inform instruction. I'm old, and old school, and so I love post-it notes. I aggregate things by post-it note to start thinking about what are the patterns in my classroom that I see maybe across a variety of skills and strategies, but also across these affective components. But yeah, I don't know, Hannah, do you have any thoughtful tips beyond that for organizing data?
Yeah, so I believe we might have some templates that we actually have on that Trusting Readers page. I can tell you the way I have done this with teachers is they would take, I'm going to say, their running record. They're going to take their running record that gave them a level and the other information that they got from that running record, and that would be a column. And then they would have a column that was about everything they had learned about the student from that discovery conference and from kid watching. So they can kind of see side by side. And then, and this is the part that Jen and I did not get to talking about tonight, what happens is that then you look at all of that and then you sit down with the student to say, so these are some things I'm thinking about working on. And I'm going to tell you what happens is that usually the thing that the teachers and I have identified is the very same thing the student will say. So I cannot tell you how many times we have thought, oh, multisyllabic words, inflected endings, like we had teachers. And so I sat down next to this little boy and I said, hey, you're in second grade, like, how's it going? Is there anything you'd like to get better at? And he said, those darn words. So he nailed it. But the difference, there was a huge difference between me coming in and saying, so for the next 5 days, we're going to be decoding multisyllabic words and looking at, he named it. So that was a kind of long answer to your question. But yes, it's just literally putting side by side whatever your formal data is next to the other data, the discovery data that you have connected.
And earlier in the chat, I did post a link to our books webpage because I'm not like pushing like go buy the book. You go buy the book, but also on that page there are some free companion resources which include things like the Discovery Conference and like a template for note taking. If you're interested in something even that specific, those exist there. It's earlier in the chat, and I'm not sure I'm smart enough to do that again, to put in the chat, to be honest with you.
Yeah, so thank you so much for coming. We are very happy to, Zoom hangout for a few minutes to answer people's questions. And I'll also tell you that we really do answer our emails. So I have people from conferences. In fact, this happened from being in Canada, where somebody said, oh, I really want to go do discovery conferences in my classroom. And I said, great, email me about it. Tell me how it's going. And people do. So we really do answer our email. So if there's something that you are trying out, maybe discovery conferences, maybe, some kid watching and you have some questions about that, let us know and we would be happy to hear about it.
Yeah. And this is also where we post other opportunities or maybe some of our additional thinking in blog posts. So if you're interested in more, there is more out there. But we appreciate all of you taking an hour out of your evening to be with us tonight and to spend some time thinking about these other more effective components of your students' reading lives.